Welcome back to the series we're doing about Christian church history in Scotland. And last time we looked at the war years in the 20th century, and now we're looking in the 20th century again about the rise of Darwinism and what happened in the church at that time. In the 19th century, Charles Darwin's book, Origin of Species in 1859, took the West by storm, and it presented another worldview to that of the biblical one. It began as a theory in biology, but it ended up transforming every area of society. Its roots lie in the Hindu-Greek ancient philosophy, which were awakened in the 18th century Enlightenment and flourished later through Charles Darwin, combining science, that's microevolution, with philosophy, that's the macroevolution. Lord Monboddo, or James Burnet, was from Edinburgh, and he was a High Court judge. As a member of the world's oldest surviving Freemason lodge building in Edinburgh's Canongate, he was very much part of the philosophical debate there. He wrote several books in which he promoted a form of theistic evolution which had been influenced by the ancient Greeks, as he tells us, like Aristotle and Plato. Back in 1768, Monboddo wrote that the rational man has grown out of the mere animal, and that reason and animal sensation, however distinct we imagine them, run into one another by such insensible degrees that it is as difficult, or perhaps more difficult, to draw the line betwixt these two than betwixt the animal and vegetable. Although Monboddo's theorising about humans with tails made him a laughing-stock of Edinburgh, Lord Neaves, a later High Court judge from 1875, could write the ditty: "Though Darwin now proclaims the law and spreads it far abroad, oh, the man that first the secret saw was honest old Monboddo. The architect precedence takes of him that bears the hoddo, so up and at 'em, land of cakes, will vindicate Monboddo." By 1795, Monboddo was in full swing in his fourth volume of Ancient Metaphysics. He wrote, "There are, I know, many who will think this progress of man, from a quadruped and an orangutan to men such as we see them nowadays, very disgraceful to the species. But they should consider their own progress as an individual. In the womb, man is no better than the vegetable. If, therefore, there be such progress in the individual, is it not to be that there should be progress also in the species, from the mere animal up to the intellectual creature?" One of the younger men in the same Masonic lodge as Monboddo was Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, who studied medicine at Edinburgh University between 1753 and 1754. In 1794, he promoted evolutionary ideas with his Zoonomia and stated that this idea of the gradual generation of all things seems to have been as familiar to the ancient philosophers as to the modern ones. He adapted Monboddo's view of theistic evolution to a pantheistic evolutionary worldview with an eternal universe, and pursued this belief in his poem called The Temple of Nature, published in 1803, in which Hindu-Greek concepts shine clearly through his footnotes. The strange thing is that Charles Darwin gives no credit to either his grandfather or Monboddo in his list of influences given in the preface of his Origin of Species, although he does mention allusions to the subject in classical writers, meaning the ancient Greeks. Charles Darwin studied medicine at Edinburgh University between 1825 and 1827. He also joined the Plinian Society there in 1826. He would have been aware of the discussions in the city around evolutionary ideas at this stage. He later recalled the following when he was at Edinburgh University. "I had previously read the Zoonomia by my grandfather," he said, "in which similar views to Lamarck are maintained, but without producing any effect on me. Nevertheless, it is probable that hearing rather early in life such views maintained and praised may have favoured my upholding them under a different form in my Origin of Species." Between 1831 and 1836 he went on board the HMS Beagle as a naturalist. Here he read Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology in 3 volumes published between 1830 and 1833 by this Scotsman. This book argued for an Earth that was hundreds of millions of years old and was based on James Hutton's book in 1788. Darwin was convinced that this huge amount of time was vital for macroevolution to occur, all living species evolving from the same common ancestor. In 1837, Darwin first drew his famous evolutionary tree in his notebook and entitled it Zoonomia, showing his grandfather's influence. He had by now become convinced that species were mutable productions. In 1859, he published his book Origin of Species. In 1871, his next key book came out called The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, which spelled out his belief that humans have evolved from apes. Scientists were heatedly divided over Darwin's dangerous idea. Many leading scientists said that whilst the first part of his theory was already well established and known, and scientific, that is, microevolution, evolution on a small scale, the conclusion of macroevolution was based on a philosophy rather than on actual real evidence-based and empirical science. Some realized that his theory had opened up the gate to atheism. Others realized that his theory would spread to all areas of society beyond biology and that morality would be destroyed. He asked Adam Sedgwick, a Christian and the professor of geology at Cambridge University, to recommend Origin of Species. But he would not do so. He wrote, "I have read your book with more pain than pleasure. You have deserted the true method of induction. Many of your wide conclusions are based upon assumptions which can neither be proved nor disproved." He then outlined the dangerous moral consequences of the theory for the future if it was fully accepted, saying that humanity, in my mind, would suffer a damage that might brutalize it and sink the human race into a lower grade of degradation than any into which it has fallen since its written records tell us of its history. At first, most Christians were horrified at Darwin's dangerous idea. But then Professor Henry Drummond, who worked in the Extraordinary Revival in Edinburgh with the American D.L. Moody, began to champion macroevolution. His impact on thousands of university students in Scotland, Britain, America and Europe was huge. Combining an evangelistic fervour with a scientific training, he laid out his approach in his popular book, Natural Law in the Spiritual World, written in 1882, which by 1899 had sold 123,000 copies in Britain alone. He experienced much opposition to its contents, particularly in Scotland, but he believed a new model was needed for his time. While some claimed his book had been instrumental in their conversion to Christ, others were deeply worried about the long-term damage its mixed message might cause. Drummond wrote in the Expositor in 1885, "According to science, evolution is the method of creation. The supreme contribution of evolution to religion is that it has given us a clearer Bible. Evolution has given to theology a vastly more reasonable body of truth about God and man. Evolution has given Christianity a new Bible. The Bible is not a book which has been made, it has grown. Hence, it is no longer a mere word book, nor a compendium of doctrines, but a nursery of growing truths." By this time, church scholars had been scurrying around trying to accommodate the new science into Genesis. With Hutton and Lyell's work in geology, apparently demonstrating that the earth was millions of years old, the traditional understanding of a young earth was rejected by most scholars, and they adopted various new ideas. Thomas Chalmers' gap theory in 1812, or Hugh Miller's age-day theory in 1856, and now theistic evolution took off in the Bible colleges in the 1880s. Into this mixture came the higher criticism of the German scholars, in which the Bible was dissected and removed as the authority for the church. Ferdinand Christian Bauer founded the liberal Tübingen School of Theology, mixing Christianity with the ideas from Hegel and other Enlightenment philosophers. This college flourished in the 1840s. Even the New Testament was being picked apart. It was at this same time that David Strauss, Bauer's pupil at Tübingen, wrote The Life of Jesus in 1835. In this he followed the views of Hegel and modern materialism, casting aside all miracles as being myths and Christian propaganda. He went so far that he rejected the virgin birth, the resurrection of Christ, and his divinity. By the time he wrote The Old Faith and the New in 1873, he was arguing that it was no longer sensible for an educated person to be a Christian. But there was scope, he suggested, in being religiously pious towards the universe. Along with this came the Graf-Wellhausen theories that demolished the 5 books of Moses. Combined with macroevolutionary ideas, an extremely toxic philosophy entered the Scottish Church. Beginning with Professor A.B. Davidson in the Free Church, a stream of other Bible College professors emerged, teaching liberal doctrines. William Robertson Smith, Henry Drummond, Marcus Dodds, and A.B. Bruce being the leaders of this movement. Dodds strode down the liberal path so far that he rejected Christ's atonement for sin, and the resurrection, and the divinity of Christ. In an extraordinary twist of history, the Free Church exonerated Dodds and A.B. Bruce in 1890, so that Finlayson could say that the 20th century opened with a blare of trumpets sounding the victory of liberalism and the complete rout of the traditionalism. A combination of Enlightenment philosophy and Darwinian evolution was destroying the church in Scotland. With the 3 leaders all living in Edinburgh at one time, David Hume, James Hutton, and Charles Darwin. Just as Adam Sedgwick and others had predicted, with the acceptance of Darwinism as science and rejection of the Bible as God's authority, attention was also now turned to morality, psychology, sociology, and sexuality. Even God would have to evolve. 2 leading atheists from Britain and America in the 20th and 21st centuries expressed their delight with Darwin. Richard Dawkins, a science professor from Oxford University, who loves Edinburgh, wrote, "An atheist before Darwin could have said, following Hume, I have no explanation for complex biological design. All I know is that God isn't a good explanation. So we must wait and hope that somebody comes up with a better one." I can't help feeling that such a position, though logically sound, would have left one feeling pretty unsatisfied, and although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Daniel Dennett, a professor of philosophy from the Tufts University in America, could state, "Little did I realize that in a few years I would encounter an idea, Darwin's idea, being an unmistakable likeness to universal acid. It eats through just about every traditional concept, and it leaves in its wake a revolutionized worldview, with most of the old landmarks still recognizable, but transformed in fundamental ways." It would be this Darwinian universal acid that would indeed eat its way into everything in Scotland and the Western world, as traditional beliefs and long-accepted practices would be subjected to close scrutiny and would, one by one, disintegrate under pressure from the zeitgeist of the 20th century, leaving behind a social landscape barely recognisable in Scotland's land of the book. With Darwinism being seen as a scientific foundation for human behaviour, it is not surprising that liberal scholars began to re-examine sexuality. First there came Sigmund Freud, the father of psychology. With evolution as his scientific foundation, he explored human sexuality, believing that most of our problems revolve around this. His 3 essays in the theory of sexuality of 1905 became the foundation of Western thought on sexuality. Freud's student, William Reich, went further. He combined Freud, Darwin and Marx and set up sex clinics. His motto in 1927 was "Free sexuality within an egalitarian society." In 1930, he set up the German Association for the Proletarian Sexual Politics, or Sexpol, in Berlin as part of the Communist Party. Riots broke out between communists and National Socialists, who sought to remove this influence. He fled to America and wrote 2 influential books: The Mass Psychology of Fascism in 1933, in which he said the traditional marriage and family model had to be abolished because it led to fascism, and The Sexual Revolution of 1936. A really key part of the growing sexual revolution in the 20th century came through what was called the Frankfurt School. In 1923, a group of pioneers established the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt. The goal was to overthrow capitalism, Christianity, and traditional marriage and family. The main influences were from Hegel, Marx, Darwin, and Freud. In 1930, the director, Max Horkheimer, invited a group of intellectuals to join him in Frankfurt. They were driven out of Germany by the Nazis and settled in New York, where they established a new school of social research. From this group, including Erich Fromm, Herbert Marcuse, and Theodor Adorno, came the modern New Left and sexual revolution. Influenced by those just mentioned just now, Dr. Alfred Kinsey received government funding to research human sexuality, first with males, then with females. His PhD was in evolutionary biology, so this was a foundation for his research. He believed that we are just evolved animals who can express every kind of sexuality, and that only repressive control, such as shown in religion, prevents this freedom. He said, "No man in modern times," stated a team of investigators in 1990, "has shaped public attitudes to and perceptions of human sexuality more than the late Alfred C. Kinsey." He advocated that all sexual behaviours considered deviant were normal, while polemicizing that exclusive heterosexuality was abnormal and a product of cultural inhibitions and societal conditioning. However, his data was selectively taken from those known to be living dissolute lives, such as prostitutes, those in prison, and loose students. He then projected these results onto the general population, thus normalizing every kind of sexuality under the guise of science. The famous psychologist Abraham Maslow warned him about this unscientific bias, but he ignored his advice. One team of researchers boldly stated that few people realized that the data he presented were not as claimed scientific, nor were the data representative of societal norms, and it is now becoming clear that, in addition to being highly biased, Kinsey's results may have been fraudulent. Thus, the sexual revolution of the 1960s exploded, and as Hugh Hefner declared, Kinsey is the patron saint of pornography. So what we see as a result of Darwinist understanding, that people took that on board and applied it to sexuality, and out of that came the sexual revolution. We see that the flower power 1960s movement that took place came out directly from these intellectuals beforehand, and particularly with Alfred Kinsey. As we conclude this section, we looked at Darwinism, the idea of macroevolution which began to spread through Scotland and the West, and really affected the way we think and how we live. From the foundation of evolution, we see the rising up of intellectuals and thinkers, who then would go and apply this to sexuality and morality. And we would start to see even those Christian views which we see in the Bible being also eroded and replaced. We would see a sexual revolution that would explode out of these thinkers coming from a foundation in Darwinian evolution. And so when we look next time, we'll be looking at our own culture, what's going on in Scotland in the 21st century.